My mother didn't even look at my face. She looked at my belly, and she said, "You've always been selfish, Sarah. Your sister needs this legacy. You just need to sign the papers and let us raise the baby as hers. I want you to sit with that for a second." My own mother, standing in my kitchen, asking me to hand over my daughter before she was even born. I was 7 months pregnant. I could feel her kicking as my parents negotiated her away, like she was a line item in a business deal. They thought they had me cornered. They thought because I was just the daughter, not the favorite, not the fragile one, not the one they'd built their whole identity around protecting, I would fold, sign the papers, disappear quietly, the way I always had. But they made one mistake, a small one, the kind of mistake that destroys everything. They didn't know I'd been recording since the moment they walked through my door, and they had no idea that 10 minutes later, when my doorbell rang, the person standing on my porch was about to end everything they'd spent their whole lives protecting. Stay with me until the end, because what happened when I opened that door didn't just save my daughter. It took away every single thing my parents thought they were entitled to. Let's go back to where this started, because to understand how cruel that moment in my kitchen really was, you need to understand exactly what my family had already taken from me, long before I was ever pregnant. My name is Sarah. I was always the practical one, the reliable one, the one nobody worried about, because worrying about someone usually means you're paying attention to them, and my parents' attention had exactly one home, my older sister, Elena. Elena was fragile, in the way some families decide one child gets to be fragile and the other gets to be fine, no matter what's actually happening underneath. Growing up, if Elena had a bad day, the whole house rearranged itself around her. If I had a bad day, I was told to be strong, because Elena needed me to be strong for her. I moved out at 18, put myself through college, built a career, a marriage, a life, almost entirely without my parents' involvement, because involvement, in my family, always came with conditions I wasn't willing to meet. The one person who never made me feel like an afterthought was my grandmother, my mother's mother. She was sharp, funny, and completely unbothered by the family hierarchy everyone else seemed to worship. She used to tell me, quietly, over tea, "You're the only one in this family who doesn't need me to fix anything for you, Sarah. That's not nothing. That's everything." 6 months ago, she passed away. She left behind a substantial estate, a house on the coast, a stock portfolio, and a trust fund worth several $1,000,000. And buried in the legal language of her will was one condition that would end up changing my entire life. The majority of the estate would transfer to the first biological grandchild born into the family. Elena had been trying to conceive for almost 4 years, with no success, cycle after cycle of disappointment that my parents treated like a national tragedy. I, meanwhile, was 3 months pregnant with my first child at the time of the reading of the will, a pregnancy I hadn't even announced to my family yet, because some instinct in me already knew how they'd react. I was right to wait, because the moment they eventually found out, I watched my mother's face shift from surprise into something colder, something calculating. I had no idea, in that moment, just how far they were willing to go to fix what they saw as a problem. I only found out 3 days before my mother stood in my kitchen and asked me to give away my daughter. It didn't start with a direct request. It started with small comments, dropped so casually I almost didn't notice the pattern until it was too late. "Elena would be such a good mother, don't you think?" my mother said one Sunday dinner, apropos of nothing, staring at me over her wine glass. "You're so busy with your career, Sarah," my father added a few weeks later. "How exactly are you planning to manage a newborn and your job?" I brushed it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself my own parents wouldn't actually. And that's when I need to stop and tell you about the phone call. It was a Tuesday evening. My husband, Daniel, was working late. I was alone, 6 months pregnant, folding tiny onesies on our bed, when my mother called. "Your father and I want to come by this weekend," she said. "We want to talk about the baby, about arrangements." Arrangements. I remember that word sitting in my chest like a stone. I didn't sleep much that week. 3 days later, they showed up at my house unannounced. No call, no text, just their car in my driveway, and two determined faces at my front door. I let them in because some part of me, even then, still wanted to believe I was wrong about all of it. I wasn't wrong. They sat me down at my own kitchen table, and my mother pulled a folded document out of her purse like she'd rehearsed the moment. A private agreement, drafted by a lawyer I'd never heard of. The terms were laid out clean and cold. I would go away, quietly, to a private clinic out of state, for the final months of my pregnancy and the birth. I would sign over my parental rights. Elena and her husband would legally present my daughter to the estate's attorneys as their own biological child, using a fabricated timeline they'd apparently already discussed with a fertility clinic willing to falsify records. In exchange, my parents would pay off my mortgage. They were offering to buy my daughter, and they'd priced her at the cost of a house. I felt something in my chest go completely cold and completely still. Not panic, not tears. Something quieter and more dangerous than either of those. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just reached into the pocket of my cardigan, where my phone had been sitting since the moment they knocked, and I pressed record. What they said in the next 10 minutes is something I will never be able to forget for the rest of my life. But before I tell you exactly what came out of my mother's mouth next, I need you to understand something about the person who was already on their way to my house at that exact moment. Because nothing that happened next was an accident. The shouting started the second I said the word no. My father's face went red almost instantly. Ungrateful, he said, jabbing a finger toward me across the table. After everything this family has given you, this is how you repay us? Given me? I said, my voice shaking despite everything I'd rehearsed in my head over the years. What exactly have you given me that you're calling in the debt on right now? My mother's composure cracked completely. The first grandchild has to be Elena's, she shrieked, actually rising out of her chair, one hand slamming flat against the table hard enough to rattle the plates. Your sister has spent 4 years destroying herself trying to have a baby, and you get pregnant on your first try, and you think you get to just keep her? Keep all of it? She's my daughter, I said, not a line item on Grandma's will. She could be Elena's salvation. My mother snapped back, stepping around the table now, closer to me than I wanted her to be, her hand raised halfway in the air, in a gesture I'd never seen her make toward me before. Not quite a threat, but close enough that my whole body went rigid. That was the moment. The exact moment they crossed a line, neither of them would ever be able to walk back. My father kept talking, laying out logistics, the clinic, the falsified paperwork, the payment schedule for my silence, like he was closing a business deal instead of negotiating away his own granddaughter. My mother kept circling the same furious point, over and over. It has to be Elena's. It has to be Elena's. You don't deserve this the way she does. They were so consumed by their own certainty, so blinded by 20 years of putting Elena's needs above mine, without a second thought, that neither of them noticed the headlights sweeping briefly across my living room window. Neither of them heard the quiet sound of a car door closing in my driveway. I heard it, and for the first time all evening, underneath the fear, I felt something else creeping in. Relief. Because I knew exactly who that was. And I knew that in about 90 seconds my parents were about to find out that the practical daughter they'd spent a lifetime underestimating had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. The doorbell rang, cutting straight through the shouting. The room went silent instantly. My mother's hand dropped back to her side. My father turned toward the front hall, confused, his mouth still half open on whatever sentence he'd been building. I stood up slowly, smoothing my sweater over my belly, and walked past both of them without a word. My legs were shaking, but my hands, for the first time that entire evening, were completely steady. I opened the door. Standing on my porch wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a delivery driver. It was Marcus Whitfield, my grandmother's longtime attorney, a tall, silver-haired man who had known me since I was a child, sneaking cookies out of her kitchen, and beside him, 2 uniformed officers. Here's what my parents didn't know. I hadn't just started recording that night out of instinct. I had called Marcus an hour before my parents ever knocked on my door, my voice shaking, telling him I was afraid of what my parents were about to propose, because I'd overheard enough of Elena's phone calls over the past month to already suspect exactly what was coming. Marcus stepped past me into the house, his expression calm in a way that somehow made the room feel colder. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice even, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I understand you've been discussing the terms of the late Mrs. Gable's will." My father's face drained of color. "Marcus, this is a family matter, we don't need—" "It's a shame," Marcus continued, cutting him off without raising his voice even slightly, "that you never read the updated codicil your mother-in-law signed exactly 1 week before she passed." My mother went very, very still. "A codicil," Marcus said, opening a leather folder and holding it out, explicitly stating that any attempt to coerce, manipulate, falsify, or otherwise interfere with the rightful inheritance of her first biological great-grandchild would result in the immediate and total forfeiture of the entire estate, including the primary residence currently occupied by Robert and Linda Miller. "The house you're standing in right now," he meant. "My parents' house." My grandmother had put a clause in her will, quietly, deliberately, protecting the one grandchild she trusted, because some part of her, even from a hospital bed, must have suspected exactly what my parents were capable of. My mother's mouth opened, but nothing came out. My father sat down heavily in the nearest chair, staring at the recording device Marcus placed on the table beside the folder, the one I'd handed him the moment he walked in, capturing every single word my parents had said that night. "Today I'm sitting in my grandmother's garden, the one she used to tell me was the only place in the world where nobody was allowed to make her feel small. My daughter Grace is sleeping in her bassinet beside me, one small fist curled against her cheek. My parents lost everything: the house, the trust fund, and most importantly, every bit of access they once had to me, and now, to my daughter. Elena hasn't spoken to me since that night. I understand, in some strange way, why she can't. She spent 4 years believing my daughter might be the answer to her own grief, and I was the obstacle standing between her and that possibility. But that's a price I was always willing to pay, because the moment my mother looked at my pregnant belly and saw an asset instead of a grandchild, there was no version of this story where I stayed quiet to keep the peace. I stood completely alone against the 2 people who were supposed to protect me more than anyone else in the world. And because I refused to stay silent, my daughter will never have to grow up wondering whether she was loved, wanted, or simply useful. If you've ever felt like your own family saw you as a tool instead of a person, someone useful, not someone loved, I want you to hear this clearly. Your voice is the greatest weapon you will ever own. Don't put it down for anyone, even the people who raised you. Comment below and tell me I am not for sale. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe to She Stood Alone for more true stories of strength and justice, and tap the bell so you never miss the next one. I'll see you in the next video.